On March 24th, 2020, Pepita Redhair was dropped off at her boyfriend's house by her mom, Anita. Anita had been worried about Pepita, but she could not have known that this would be the last time that she would see her daughter. Was Pepita a victim of human trafficking, or was her boyfriend responsible for making her disappear? I'm Eric Carter-Londine.
And I'm Charlie Worrell.
And this is Crime Lines and Consequences. So Charlie, I know you've covered some MMIW cases on Crime Lines, and we've also covered many of them on True Consequences. Today's case I'm going to be going over with you was unfolding around the same time as Gabby Petito, but unfortunately, Pepita's case had hardly any media coverage, definitely not on a national scale, but even the local media was very reluctant to cover this case. Before we dig into what happened to Pepita, I want to share some statistics on missing and murdered Indigenous people, which are not 100% accurate because of the nature of these cases. Oftentimes, there isn't a lot of collaboration between law enforcement agencies, and sometimes missing Indigenous people are not reported missing either because the police refuse to file a report or families don't even know that their loved one has disappeared. So you'll often see that when it comes to issues like mental health and substance abuse.
Another issue with reporting that I've seen, especially when we're looking at more historic cases, is that it wouldn't be recorded. You were either Black, white, or Asian. And so they would record the missing person's race as whatever they looked most like.
Right.
And so it was not a perfect system. And there were some places that would use the marker N for Native, and then they would also use N for Negro. Obviously, historic cases here. And so we really don't know the numbers. Even if we looked through every single record and pulled all of them, we will still miss some because they were not being properly categorized.
Right. Absolutely. This was not the case with Pepita, though. She didn't have mental health issues. She did have some substance abuse, but she wasn't necessarily strung out on the streets or anything. She had a home. Her family acted quickly. As soon as they suspected she was missing, they did everything right, but it still just wasn't enough. The National Crime Information Center reports that in 2016, there were 5,712 reports of missing American Indian and Alaska Native women and girls throughout the United States. Even though there were over 5,000 missing women and girls that were reported, only 116 of those cases were logged into NamUs. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention has reported that murder is the third leading cause of death among American Indian and Alaska Native women, and that rates of violence on reservations can be up to 10 times higher than the national average. And then, of course, the states that are experiencing the highest number of cases of what's reported is New Mexico, has the highest, followed by Washington, Arizona, Alaska, Montana, California, Nebraska, Utah, Minnesota, and Oklahoma. Those are just the states that have the most.
I was going to say, those are the states with the most sovereign nations and American Indian reservations. I mean, those are that you might as well just list those states. It's the same. So where there is the most people, we're seeing these numbers higher, but it's interesting to me that New Mexico comes ahead of Alaska because proportionate to the population, Alaska, I believe, has a higher Indigenous population, and Oklahoma may as well. I mean, New Mexico doesn't have the highest percentage. So obviously this is a big problem in New Mexico when it's disproportionately higher than it already being disproportionately higher across the country. That's an interesting fact. I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, New Mexico is up there. And I think a lot of it has to do with the Navajo Nation being as large as it is and having as many members as it has. And of course, the Navajo Nation does span across 3 states. And so it is probable that a lot of these cases get reported maybe in Shiprock, where there's some tribal government there. But it may be somebody who's on the outskirts of Arizona or on the outskirts of Utah that goes to New Mexico to report a missing loved one.
That's a good point. The Navajo Nation does have the highest number of missing Indigenous women, but also it's the largest sovereign nation within the United States.
And it has the biggest population, I believe. So the fact of the matter is that these cases are grossly underreported. There's not a national database that is comprehensive in listing these cases. But before we get into the disappearance of Pepita, I want you to just listen to her mom as she talks to us about who Pepita was.
Pepita was a person. She was a loving, kind young lady. And ever since she was born, I took care of her. And she has other brothers and she has sisters. So she graduated from high school. And she also went attend community college, university. And also in Albuquerque, she went to C&M to continue her education. And she was a bright young lady. She's always having this big smile. And she will always call me every day and ask me how I'm doing. Mom, are you okay? Everything okay? Do you need anything? I'll be coming home this day. I missed her so much. It was a really bright young lady. I missed her. And she likes to draw. And her favorite hobby was skateboarding.
I love that.
She loves to skateboard downtown. She did. And she liked talking to people. She likes to make friends.
So that was my interview that I did on True Consequences with Anita King. It was over the phone, so it's not the most clear audio that you can get, but you could really hear the heartbreak in her voice as she's describing her daughter and what she meant to her and how much she misses her. One of the things that kind of made me smile was just imagining Pepita going around downtown Albuquerque on a skateboard. She seemed like a pretty free spirit.
Yeah, having finally been to Albuquerque to visit you and do a live show, you took me through the downtown area. So, I can also picture that. But I imagine living there, you see people going through downtown on their skateboards, just living their lives. And it's one of those things that always makes me stop when I think about how normal someone's life was and then tragedy strikes. We sometimes talk about these tragedies almost as though they happened in isolation, like this, just we plucked this one day out of someone's life, but they had a whole full life before that. And it's nice when we talk to the families because that's when we can really capture that and hear from them beyond reading it in an obituary or a newspaper article.
Yeah, it gives so much more weight to that, really humanizing that this is a real person we're talking about who had hopes and dreams and aspirations. So, like I said before, on March 24th, 2020, Pepita Redhair was dropped off at her boyfriend's house by her mom. She had been dealing with some domestic violence in her relationship for a while. Friends and family had noticed that she would have bruises on her body. They were very worried about her. Her mom in particular was worried about her. She was worried about her safety. And Anita told Pepita that she could come back home anytime. She could stay in her childhood room. She hadn't touched anything in there. Everything was exactly as Pepita had left it. And she just wanted her to come home so that she knew that she was safe. But Pepita was not interested in that. She had a lot of, like I said, dreams and aspirations. She was ambitious. She wanted to be independent. She wanted to live her life and really wanted to explore the world.
And Pepita grew up in Crown Point, and that's almost 2 hours from Albuquerque. So moving back home wasn't moving across town or moving, to another city. It's moving away from everything she had in Albuquerque. And you and I both left our hometowns, our little hometowns, and branched out into new cities. And I mean, it would be a big deal to uproot that, to move back to your childhood home.
Yeah, I wouldn't do it, honestly.
I wouldn't either. I mean, can't imagine.
We are middle-aged now, but even if I was in my 20s, I wouldn't do it.
No, I actually think back to my 20s and I can't imagine going home then. I think I would actually have been more stubbornly against it in my 20s than I am now.
Absolutely agree with you. Like I said, Pepita wasn't interested in uprooting her life. And despite her fear, Anita said goodbye to her daughter, not knowing that it would be the last time that she would see her. Prior to her disappearance, Pepita was visiting her family in Crown Point. It's a small town on the Navajo Nation in McKinley County, somewhat close to Gallup, New Mexico. Pepita is described as someone who was too big for Crown Point. She didn't see a lot of opportunity. It could be depressed on the Navajo Nation. You know, some parts of it there's not running water or electricity. And so Crown Point, being a small town, probably wasn't as depressed as some of the more rural areas, but there still wasn't a lot of opportunities to find a good paying job, which is why she wanted to move to Albuquerque, because there was more opportunity.
That's a big reason people will leave the reservations. There's just not a lot of jobs in a lot of them. When the reservation system was formed, the government was purposely giving land that wasn't great. So that's difficult to run wires and indoor plumbing and things like that to these more remote areas, because that was by design. That's the land that they were told they could have. And you don't think the government was giving up prime land. Of course not. And when they would just move further out into a different area and say, now this is your land because we found oil on what used to be your land. So this situation is so common across reservations that there are just not jobs, and people, it's big in South Dakota having to move to Rapid City or to Sioux Falls when their reservations are really where they grew up. It's where their support system is, but they're forced out to find a job. And then like Pepita, they put their roots down in the city. Right. And then that becomes their support system. So it's even harder to go home. It's a cycle. And it's one, I know you've covered MMIW cases. A lot of them are intimate partner violence related. I've covered a lot of them. And this is something that I feel like I've heard it before. And it's how do you break out of that cycle?
I think talking about it is a really good first step, right? If we're talking about domestic violence and intimate partner violence happens way more than people want to admit.
Yes.
And way more people are affected by it than we know. And until we're willing to face that, we can't expect it to change because it is so prevalent. And I'll get into some of that here in a moment as well. Like I said, Pepita had a lot of dreams, but she loved living in the city. She loved spending time with her family and would make regular trips back to Crown Point, but was always ready to come back home to Albuquerque, where she was, like you said, putting her roots down. She started attending college classes, and in 2016, she met a man and started dating him. And Anita had asked me not to use his name because it has created a lot of problems, so I'm not going to be using his name during this. There are other places where his name has been mentioned, and you can find that there if you're interested in that. The couple was known to be very affectionate with each other. Pepita's family was hopeful, and they noticed how happy she seemed when she started dating him. She also started to show more interest in the traditional Navajo wedding ceremonies and began asking friends and family about that process. It all seemed to be going pretty well, and the future seemed pretty bright for the young couple. And everyone in the family started to feel like this was going to be a positive thing for Pepita. But then the family started to learn that Pepita was being hit by her boyfriend. And she disclosed to her family that she was in an abusive relationship. Her family had begged her to leave her boyfriend and return to Crown Point, but she told them that there was nothing there for her. There was no opportunity. She also told her family that she loved her boyfriend and wanted to be with him on that day that Anita dropped her off. She reassured her mom that everything would be okay. She told her that she loved her and asked her to take care of herself, and told her mom to drive home safe. I want you to hear from Anita as she's discussing this time period.
Ever since she met the guy that she thought she loved, she had changed. The alcohol was available. So she just, she just got into it, but she wasn't as bad as an alcoholic. I didn't know my daughter that she was a bad alcoholic. I mean, she wasn't homeless. She had a home. She had a room. She left everything behind. The way it is when we took her back to Albuquerque. The room was still waiting for her. It was still the same setup. Just like I said, if the family that individual was with her, cared about her, loved her, my daughter wouldn't go missing. My daughter wouldn't have been beaten to this was bruised, her lip was busted, and then she wouldn't have been in domestic violence.
Yeah.
And And I deal with it every day since day one. My life has changed. How would people sleep? How would that person eat and sleep? That's what, I'm a very respectful person. I don't go out and terrorize the family. And I just want answers. There's no lead, but somebody needs something. Really need answers. We did need help. She would have always called me. Just like I said, she was always in contact with me. Her and I went shopping. And I missed that. And then listening to me, reading the story, something from her, they come forward.
It's really heartbreaking to hear her talking about noticing the bruises and the busted lip on Pepita and feeling really helpless in trying to get Pepita out of that situation. It's so sad.
And didn't Pepita try to reassure her mom by saying she'll go to a friend's house if things escalate? But we know it's not that easy to always leave a situation. Physically, it's not always easy if you're being kept from leaving, whether through threats or through physical being held there. So I understand why Pepita was trying to reassure her mom with this, but also why Anita was not reassured by this. You don't want your child to ever be in a house or in a relationship where they're like, well, if I have to flee, here's my escape plan. No, you want them to be safe. And when you know they're not, and you know you're over an hour and a half away, and they're an adult, the powerless feeling that Anita must have had in that situation, dropping her off and just not feeling good about it, but having no other choice. And then only for her to wait for a phone call from Pepita, which she called her all the time. They were constant contact. And that phone call not coming for how many days before she called the police?
It was 3 days before she called the police.
Yeah. The 3 very long days for her, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, just like you said, she texted Pepita every single day. They talked in the morning, they talked at night. So it was really unusual for her to stop messaging her mom out of nowhere. And it wasn't until the 27th of March that Anita decided 3 days later to call Pepita's boyfriend to ask where she was. His reply to her was, I don't know. She just left, which gave a lot of concern to Anita because she went from being just a little bit worried to completely terrified now that something horrible has happened to her daughter.
Mm-hmm.
And then you probably know this, maybe some of our listeners don't know, but family in the Dene culture is extremely important. That connection to your relatives is one of the most important bonds that exists in that culture. And Pepita and Anita were often, like I said, always in contact. Her mom, Anita, knew something was very wrong, so she started calling the rest of the family to let them know that Pepita was missing. Her next step was, of course, to contact the police. She had to get a hold of the Albuquerque Police Department because Pepita went missing in Albuquerque. The response from the police was less than helpful. They told Anita that Pepita was an adult and was allowed to go missing if she wanted to be.
Yeah, there's no crime in a 27-year-old not calling their mother.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, we have a mother who called the boyfriend where she lived, and the boyfriend said, I haven't seen her either. Allegedly, he had not seen her. So we have 2 people not in contact, but from what I understand, he wasn't exactly on the phone with the police at this point.
No, it took him a lot longer to call the police and report her missing than it did for Anita. And I think the only reason he did was because Anita was making so much noise about Pepita being gone.
Right. It had been about a month before he decided to file a report with his side of the story.
Yep. It's very suspicious. It's really frustrating just to hear this, to know that she was essentially turned away from the police department. They wouldn't even take a report for her. Then she goes to the Navajo Nation to ask them for help.
Mm-hmm.
And they say there's nothing they can do because it happened in Albuquerque.
Yeah.
And this is the kind of problems that we see in almost every single missing and murdered Indigenous person case, where they go missing either on or off the reservation, and depending on which law enforcement agency has jurisdiction and whether they want to even do anything or not, leads to situations like this where we're now 3 years out from Pepita's disappearance and we still don't know where she is.
Yeah, I think the Berlin Wall was weaker than jurisdictional lines when it comes to sovereign nations and state police. I know we've both covered a case that dealt with the Amber Alert on the Navajo Nation, and they couldn't get an Amber Alert going in time because that's a state police thing, and the state does not have any jurisdiction over Navajo Nation. The federal government does. Federal government doesn't have a federal Amber Alert system that applies here. So that caused major issues and has hopefully got us on the path to fix those issues. However, we're seeing this jurisdictional line between the nations and specifically the state police a lot. I covered a case in Wisconsin where a woman went missing. They weren't sure if she was on the Menominee Reservation when she went missing or she went missing from her apartment, which was off the reservation. And trying to figure out who is in charge, incredibly difficult.
Yeah, this must have been extremely frustrating to know that the police weren't interested in even helping the family here at all. Especially when you know that New Mexico has the highest incidence of reported missing and murdered Indigenous people in the country. That should already be a priority, knowing that.
Exactly.
And then, of course, there's a lot of terrible prejudices and ideologies about Native people that creates this culture of not caring, which is really sad.
I think the boyfriend story applies here because the boyfriend story includes that they had been drinking.
Yeah.
And once you bring up they had been drinking and an Indigenous person, and I'm saying not just Native American because this happens in Australia, this happens in Canada. Once you say substance, a Native American person, they're out on a bender. They'll be back when they're done. They're out binging, they're partying, they'll call you. We've seen that come in with 15-year-olds who are missing. So now we have a 27-year-old boyfriend says, oh, we were out drinking. And the police say, oh, well, that explains it. That explains it. It's the levels of prejudice here are pretty clear.
Yeah, it's very clear and it's systemic. It exists in all areas. And it's something that Native communities have to fight just to even get anybody to pay attention to them. Like they have to fight against that, which is not fair, in my opinion. So the family felt like they couldn't really wait for the police to do anything. So they just started going out into the neighborhoods and putting flyers out and talking to people on the streets. And they knew that Pepita was known to use public transportation. So they got on the bus and started talking to people on the bus and showing Pepita's picture to everybody, trying to get somebody to say something.
And those flyers were all printed at her mother's expense. And if you've ever mass printed anything, you know it's not cheap.
It's not. And they were in color too, which makes it even more expensive. But they talked to everybody they could. They asked them, friends about the last time that they saw Pepita. They put posters on light posts, on bus stops, doors, mailboxes, homes all around Pepita's boyfriend's family's home. But they didn't really get any leads from any of that, unfortunately. And one of the major issues that the police said was why they didn't do what they were supposed to do was the pandemic had just started. And so a lot of things were shut down in New Mexico. New Mexico was one of the most shut down states in the pandemic. So police were not even meeting or interviewing anybody face to face at that time. And their offices were completely closed to the public.
That is shocking to me because crimes were still happening. People did not take stay-at-home orders to mean don't commit crime. And I know in Kansas City, the police were not pulling people over for minor speeding violations as to limit contact with people. But if a crime occurred, you could go to the police and they would then investigate it. So the fact that this was given as a reason, I mean, I can understand a reason why a college campus might be closed or Walmart might only let you shop in the food section and not the rest of it like they did in some states. But the police, I mean, those are mandatory what do we call it at the time? People who had to work, essential workers.
Essential workers, yeah.
I mean, my kid had to go to Walmart to work. I'm sure the police could have shown up.
Absolutely. And there was enough technology. I mean, this was just 3 years ago. You don't have to meet face to face. You could do a FaceTime
Exactly.
or a Zoom call or
Mhm.
something. So I just don't understand that logic.
Just to gather information, see who saw her last, who was with her after her mom dropped her off. Was it really just her boyfriend, or did they see friends that night? Which comes back to his story a little bit. What happened? Go talk to those people and just gather information, if nothing else.
Yeah. The very least, file a
Mhm.
police report. The very least. So
Mhm.
I just don't get it. But it did make it more difficult for the family. And as you can imagine, Anita and everybody in the family were really angry with the
Mhm.
Albuquerque Police Department.
Yeah.
They were tired of dealing with APD. They even reached out to local news stations, but essentially were told that they weren't going to cover a missing persons case at that time because everybody was talking about the pandemic. They felt like they had no support and no help, not from the media and definitely not from the police.
A lot of times the media won't run anything unless it comes from the police. And so the family reaching out to just your evening news aren't going to get as far as they get when, I mean, that's why we get so many families reaching out to us as independent podcasters. We can cover anything we want to cover.
Mhm.
And I've talked to families who've gotten very little local coverage because the police wouldn't cooperate with putting out the press release or being interviewed for it. And so it was dropped.
It's just not fair.
Mm-hmm.
It's not fair. But the family continued to go out and search and spread the word about Pepita. They even went into the West Mesa area of Albuquerque and searched with cadaver dogs. And I think a lot of that was because there had already been bodies that were found there with the West
bone
Mesa bone collector
Mhm.
and even other cases where people are taken out into the desert and killed. So it made sense for them to go out there. I believe that her boyfriend's house was on the west side of Albuquerque, so it wouldn't have been that far away for her to go there and to be dropped in the desert somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So Pepita's boyfriend's never been charged with anything related to her disappearance, but there are a lot of records, hospital records in particular, that show that Pepita had been seen multiple times after being assaulted by her boyfriend. It took him until April 19th to file that missing persons report. So almost a month later, she went missing on March 24th. And according to the report which he filed, he claimed that he and Pepita had an argument after they had spent the night drinking and that she stormed off. That was his story. He said that Pepita had received a text message from a man named Laramie, who apparently was the last person who saw Pepita alive, according to Pepita's boyfriend. So the family started trying to find this Laramie guy. They went on to social media. They were going out again, canvassing the area. He did reach back out to Anita and told her that the last time that he saw Pepita was on his birthday on March 10th, not on March 24th. He told her that Pepita had bought him a cupcake and sang happy birthday to him, and that this made Pepita's boyfriend very angry. And while he was standing there, Pepita's boyfriend hit her in front of Laramie.
Wow.
Yeah.
So the insinuation here was that she was running off with Laramie when she left boyfriend's house.
Mm-hmm.
That's what he's trying to sell.
Yes.
And Laramie saying, I haven't seen her. He didn't see her for 2 weeks before she went missing. So before she even went to visit her family.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we have two very conflicting stories.
Definitely. And it's hard to know who's telling the truth. And unfortunately, Laramie has passed away since
Okay.
this. So he's not available to discuss this or to
Mhm.
elaborate further. But he did say that he watched Pepita's boyfriend hit her and he left after that because he didn't want to see that happening.
Mm-hmm.
And we've already talked about this, but one of the biggest issues that we see in a lot of MMIW cases is intimate partner violence being very much involved in a lot of these
Mhm.
situations. And it's no different in Pepita's case here. I have some research that I pulled up from the National Congress of American Indians. So I'm just going to rattle off some statistics really quickly because I think it's important for people to understand how prevalent intimate partner violence is on reservations and among tribal communities. So more than 4 in 5 American Indian and Alaska Native women, or 84.3% of them, have experienced violence in their lifetime. More than half of them, 56.1%, have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. More than half, 55.5%, have experienced physical violence by intimate partners, and almost half, 48.8%, have been stalked in their lifetime. American Indian and Alaskan Native women are 1.7 times more likely than white women to have experienced violence in the past year, and Native women face murder rates 10 times higher than the national average. American Indian and Alaskan Native women are almost 2 times as likely to experience rape as non-Hispanic white women over the course of their lifetime, and the murder rate of an American Indian or Alaskan Native woman is 3 times that of non-Hispanic white women. The vast majority, 96% of American Indian and Alaska Native female victims of sexual violence experience violence at the hands of a non-Native perpetrator. 21% have experienced intraracial violence.
Which, if you look at the statistics for Black women, white Hispanic women, and white women, the intraracial violence is pretty much all they experience. Interracial violence is almost unheard of. Whereas when we're talking about Native American and Alaskan Native women, we're not seeing that. We are seeing a disproportionate amount of violence from outside of their race, which I know there's a lot of debate over calling Native American a race, and I fully understand. I want to just recognize that I am knowledgeable on that, but we're just talking about categorizing things the way the government does, where we check boxes, which are very imperfect boxes.
Yeah.
But it is definitely something that is disproportionate, and I think that is something that we don't ever discuss.
And it's just so much higher than any other group experiences these things. And then if you add somebody who's identifies as trans or two-spirit into that mix, those numbers go even higher.
Yeah.
Which is terrible. Most Native American women do not report such crimes because of the belief that nothing will be done.
That belief is, we call it a belief, but it is largely a fact. If anyone is interested, look up Nome, Alaska, and the situation there where people would call the police to report a rape, and the police would not even send someone to interview them in person. The vast majority of those women were Alaskan Native women. And the other issue is that this isn't exclusive to not going to the police outside of the reservation. This includes reservation police, because reservation police are the guy who abused you's brother or cousin. It's still very largely run by men, and those men are largely relatives of people you know. And this just cycles of violence over the generations have normalized it to some degree. So there's definitely just so many, I'll keep saying it all the time, there's so many layers here that go far beyond what the surface of what we're talking about. And generational violence is one of the many layers that we're talking about. And so when you don't feel you can go to the police outside of your community due to racism, and you don't feel like you can go to the police within the reservation due to family alliances, friendships, that sort of thing, what do? You simply don't report it. And that is, so the numbers we have are guesses at best of the true numbers.
It's a staggering problem. And I do try to weave some of these facts in here because I feel like it's really important for people to understand that there are so many complicated layers in all of this, that it's not something that we can easily fix. And it's not something that is easily addressable. We have to become aware of it first, right? And there's so many layers, like I said. So you can educate yourself on more of this information, follow some organizations that are doing the research. Coalition to Stop Violence Against Native Women. There's an MMIW task force. They're looking at things all the time. And then this organization from the research that I just read to you, which is the National Congress of American Indian Policy Research Center. Very detailed information. and is as accurate as it can be at this point, I guess. All right. So I have a longer clip for you with Anita where she's talking about some of these struggles that Pepita was having, as well as what happened when she went missing. Be back in just a moment.
March 24, 2020, that's when we dropped her off around 6:20 p.m. in Albuquerque at boyfriend's place. And she got out. She said, "Mom, I love you. Take care of yourself. I'll be okay. If something happens or my boyfriend gets mad, I usually call my friends, but I never met those friends." And then on the 24th, that Tuesday, Wednesday night, Thursday, I tried getting a hold of her. Friday, I tried getting a hold of her, and I called her boyfriend. He told me that she left. So Saturday, I tried. Sunday, on Monday, I text her, and the guy had her cell phone. This guy had her cell phone. He said that some guy named Darren sold it to him, and I tried to retrieve the phone, but I never got it back. But we went and shut it off through the cellular one.
So this was just a random person that was replying to your text to your daughter.
Yes.
That's really suspicious, obviously.
Since that day on the 27th, I knew something was wrong. Something's telling me, as a mother, as a mom, you could, sense and you could feel something's wrong with one of your child. I tried calling the Albuquerque police, but I got hold of one of them, and he said that it was a random call, domestic violence case from his home. And I even told her, "Can you please go over there and ask where she went? Where is she?" And he said, "We can't interview him. We can't do anything because of COVID. We can't contact anybody in person." So I went round and round in circles again. So finally, I reported her missing, and I was told by the APD that she's free to travel. She's at that age 27. So even then, I reported her. Person called from another missing person unit, another state. They contacted me, and I gave her the description the best I can. And it's when she started, she went into the missing person day, and there was no help. I mean, they finally, afterwards, the detective was assigned to us, and he didn't really do anything because their excuses was COVID. So I deal with this every day. It's heartbreaking. It's frustrating, unknown loss. We miss you. Please come home. If you're listening to me somewhere, I know if you're out there or if somebody did something, please say something.
So that just reinforces everything that we just kind of went through, but I wanted you to hear it from Anita's voice. Any thoughts on what she shared there?
I think there's something that she said in there where she's talking about how hard it was to get anyone to listen, and even having someone reach out and say, "Oh, but we don't have resources for you." I think that is something that a lot of families deal with. I know. So Ashley Loring, Heavy Runner, has been a MMIW case that has gotten a lot of coverage. She's had multiple documentaries, a big long form podcast. Certain things have covered her case, but her family has said nobody was offering us coverage. We had to go out there and fight for it and make it happen. And I know other cases like Case Sarah Stops Pretty Places, that case has gotten a lot of traction in the media. And that's because her aunt, Grace, who had talked to my researcher for my podcast as well, fought for it and did what she had to do. She would have a Facebook Live discussing it where only 5 people showed up, but she kept doing it. And I think that is exactly what Anita's done, which is to her credit, because Pepita's case eventually was on the reboot of Disappeared, which is major coverage that she only got because she fought for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Everything that has happened in this case and any lead and any result that she's gotten has been because of the work that she has done and the work that her family has done to get out there, in spite of the fact that police and the media didn't want to talk to her or to help her at all.
And remember, she's also doing this as the breadwinner of a family with other children to care for. So 2 hours away. So she is going back and forth. She is working this around her responsibilities. Life marches on.
Yeah.
Even when you have a missing persons case, not everyone has the resources to stop what they're doing and go search for their loved one. Some people do have to work it around their work schedules and their other kids' schedules and their life. And that's definitely where Anita is. And she's doing it as best as she can. And we know about the case because she fought for coverage.
Absolutely. My heart goes out to the family, to Anita King, and to the loved ones of Pepita. I know that they miss her every single day.
Yeah.
It's been over 3 years. There's still no answers for where Pepita is or if she's even alive. My hope is that Anita will find answers sooner than later and that the family can get some peace.
Yeah. And hopefully some justice.
Yeah. Anything else you want to add about this case before we wrap it up here?
No, I appreciate you. I first heard about this case on your podcast, and I appreciate you covering it and then bringing it here for our listeners here at Crime Lines and Consequences.
Thank you. If you or someone you know has information that can lead to the whereabouts of Pepita Redhair, please call the Albuquerque Police Department at 505-242-2677. You can follow the case on Facebook. If you look for Justice for Pepita Redhair or Missing Pepita Redhair, there's several pages there that are advocating for her return. There's also a GoFundMe that has been set up by the family to help her with the search efforts, which can be very expensive because you have to feed all the searchers and pay for gas. It's not an easy process. So any donations are appreciated by the family and do go to help search for Pepita. And if you or someone you know is in a domestic violence relationship, you can call anonymously to the National Domestic Violence Hotline to speak with somebody today at 1-800-799-7233.
But if you want to join the conversation online to discuss the issues around this case or discuss this case more, you can search for Crime Lines and Consequences on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And with that, we'll see you in a couple weeks.
Bye.